This is Justice Warriors, a podcast where we think about things that are right and wrong in our world, and how Christian ideas can help us respond to them. We prefer hard questions over easy answers, and we'd love you to join us in our ramblings. Listen in, and contact us using the links in the show notes. Hello and welcome to Justice Warriors episode 37. My name's Andy, and as usual I'm joined by Leah. Say hi, Leah.
Hi there.
And Jörg. Say hi, Jörg.
Hi.
That's a comedy hi.
I usually say hello, so trying to start something different here.
Okay. Yeah, that's gone really well. So a while ago we did an episode about God's gender, and we've been chucking around ideas since then, trying to figure out where we want to go next with this topic. We feel like we ought to talk about human gender and specifically what the Bible says about it and kind of wrestle with that. We're also quite nervous about that conversation, but here it is. As I said in the previous gender-based episode, we're aware that there are lots of nasty arguments about gender happening on the internet, and we don't want to be part of something that makes it worse or something that hurts your feelings, listener, or insults anyone. So we're going to do our best, but please take what we're saying in the spirit it's intended, which is trying to be an honest discussion of an exploration of ideas around gender, where we're trampling on ideas that we don't understand. We apologise and we ask you to help us understand. All of that said, let's go. So first thing to say is we didn't have any homework. We haven't done any homework.
Oh, thank God. I thought I'd forgotten.
So let's move straight into our What Are Your Worries section. And I think I'll go first with my worries this time. So I have quite a lot of worries about this topic, some of which I've already mentioned, but I think one thing that is worrying me about this topic, the topic of the idea of talking about our gender is I don't want to be talking on behalf of other people, but I also don't want to be only talking about things that concern my very limited experience. So I want us to somehow talk about gender, which is a thing which is kind of uniquely experienced by everyone, and yet my own experience is very limited. So I think we're going to try and start thinking about our own experience and try and widen our thinking from there. But yeah, that's my worry. Leah, what are your worries about this topic?
My worry is that quite often when we do these episodes, we kind of say, well, this is what the Bible might appear to say about this topic. And then often, not too magically, but we manage to pull something of a rabbit out of a hat and say, well, actually what the Bible is really saying is something different. And I just worry that with this topic, there's no real rabbit to come out of the hat. I struggle with what I think the Bible says about gender. It seems very conservative and with a small c, and very old-fashioned, and I find it hard to imagine that it really says anything much else. So that's my struggle with this one. So yeah, a good wrestle with what we think about what the Bible has to say.
And way to set the bar for this episode. Now we have to find a rabbit.
Yeah.
Yeah, well, we don't. I've just told you there isn't one.
There isn't one.
We have to report back at the end about whether we did find a rabbit.
We found a rabbit or not. Rabbit holes, I'm sure.
Yeah, rabbit warrens is all we're going to get to.
Thank you. Jörg, what are your worries about this topic?
Oh, none at all. I don't know. I mean, there's many to begin with, and some of what both of you said, really. And one other one to add to our pile of worries is perhaps that, and I've said this, a similar thing when we did God's gender episode, is that whatever we do about this topic, we seem to be getting more preoccupied with it. So we we find ourselves in a world that's deeply gendered, whether or not we like that or not. We are signaled at birth. Nobody of us gives out a birthday card that says it's a baby and gets away with it, right? So like, it's gendered from the start. And we have come a long way to problematizing that. And yet it seems to be we're still very much preoccupied with gender through this problematization of it. And it just gets, I don't know, we're still forced to take sides in one way or another. And we manage to turn this into a culture war issue all the time. And I guess that links back to your worry. And I really don't want this episode to be that.
When you say problematize, do you mean like, are you talking about recognizing that there's a problem? Or
yeah, recognizing there's a problem with gender and so on. Like, we've come a long way of talking about, the problem of the gender binary, and that, yes, our bodies are different, but must they be read only in this way? There's a lot when you do gender studies and all that. So there's a lot more freedom, a lot more openness, and yet we still find ourselves in culture wars then around how much openness is okay, and where the limits and all that. Like, we just don't seem to get away from the topic and sort of constructing it in a way that we can actually get back to relationships.
Those who died are justified for wearing the badge. They're the chosen whites. To justify those that died. They're the chosen whites.
So we thought we'd start the conversation by talking about our own experience of gender. So Leah, would you mind telling us a bit about your experience of your gender?
Yeah, I mean, for me, being female has felt like throughout my life it's put significant limitations on what I can and cannot do. And that's been a continual source of frustration, really. It's strange having teenage sons. I'm now super aware of just how much more freedom I feel comfortable giving them. Just simple things like, one of them walked home the other night relatively late, and yeah, there's just a lot of restrictions that come with being in a female body, and there's obviously some amazing privileges that some women do experience, i.e. having children, but that's by no means a universal experience for all women. And a lot of times it feels like being female is a fight. It's almost like a little bit like Jörg was just saying, like some of the awareness that's come recently about, there's plenty of books around about data bias and the authority gap and all these things that make us very aware of the limitations of how people perceive and treat women. But they're kind of part of the answer, but they don't necessarily give you the tools to then say, well, this is what we do about it. They just more often can kind of make you feel a bit miserable and depressed, because you're like, well, yeah, this sucks, it's hard work being in conversations where you have to work that much harder for anyone to believe that you know what you're talking about, and to be constantly second guessing so much of the time about whether my opinion wasn't listened to there because I'm female, or because just it wasn't a very good opinion, or I didn't succeed in that because of my gender. And you kind of like constantly trying not to make it a thing, but wondering if it is a thing. So yeah, I mean, there are obviously advantages, but there are quite a lot of disadvantages. And I think, so for me, gender isn't really an issue about sexuality. It's an issue, for me personally, about how to be taken seriously as a human being with a brain, as a female. And
And
if I
has that experience changed over time for you? Like, would you say there were times when, I don't know, you felt more free and less free, or more at home in your gender than others? Has it improved? Has it gotten worse? That being listened to?
I think the awareness of all these issues has helped, because I look back at my teenage self and I want to say to her, you know, those things that you were finding really hard, they weren't all because of you. They weren't just because you weren't able to get your point across clearly enough, or, you know, you weren't clever enough in your arguments. They were partly because of your gender. So I guess that would have helped, because I would have internalized quite a lot of those feelings, and deciding it was me as a person that wasn't smart enough or quick-witted enough or attractive enough or whatever. And also that feeling of growing up as a teenage girl and not being like one of the pretty girls. That was really hard. And maybe there's a little bit more latitude now to be a different sort of woman, teenager growing up, to be more strong, more opinionated. But that was very much what I felt I couldn't be. I had to kind of, and I still do it now. I still hear myself doing it, apologising for telling people what to do, even when I'm in a position of authority, or apologising for, or feeling like I'm not quite smart enough to be in the conversation. And those things leave a long mark. So yeah, it has got a bit better, I would say.
All right.
Thank you. Jörg, what about you? What's your experience of gender and your gender?
It's a different story. I would describe myself as a cis male in today's terminology. Late developer, so always a bit behind my peers, waiting for my masculinity to finally kick in, dreaming of having a beard one day, that kind of stuff. So it was sort of catching up to some desire that I didn't quite fit the template, and still don't. I mean, we're talking a little bit about this in the green room, as it were, how you know, as a man, you have like either jock or geek, and it was very clear, you know, my only way in would be geek. But also, in a way, then settling into that identity to some extent, and not facing some of the issues that Leah just described. Facing some of them, I think I'm often seen as quite young, which also has to do with, you know, how masculine your body is. So there is similar questions of authority that get asked. If you're a good-looking, strong male, even in intellectual circles, you tend to be more convincing. So some of that is there, but it's not, I wouldn't say it's as strong, because as a male you can still settle into various aspects of a masculine identity. And I like to do stuff around the house and things like that. I like building projects and constructing things and making things. And, you know, if I had to analyze this would probably be also a sort of proving your masculinity kind of thing, maybe. Because it's the template. And I had a phase growing up where, because I was the youngest, I had two older brothers who made fun of me, and I was always the intellectual in the family. I was told, you can't do these things. They're not you. You can't build. And my grandfather actually then had a small project with me, just kind of we upcycled a piece of furniture, so very simple, but I was so proud of doing that. And it, like, you know, it affirmed me in a way. Yes, I can do these things. So it became, you know, to some extent, became proving yourself through these projects, as much as I like them. But, you know, I now look back and I would think I'm quite gender critical. In East Germany, some of these roles weren't as stereotypical. It was quite normal for women to do all sorts of jobs. It was not quite as normal for men to do a lot of housework, I should say. But I mean, we do share chores and all of that. But when I take a step back and look at how we actually do divide jobs around the house, they're quite stereotypical things. I do quite male things, like looking after the car and doing the house stuff and things like that. So I guess a bit more of a settled identity that I then wonder how come, because I actually don't affirm these kind of settled identities, but maybe I am actually privileging from them nonetheless. Being privileged by them nonetheless, yeah. Yeah.
I think my experience of being male, it has a lot of similarities with some of what both of you are saying. I definitely had a sense of not fitting the mould and not fitting in with the popular kids, but always wanting to, and not being quite good enough at football.
That's a big
one.
one.
While you were talking, it did remind me of an experience I then had of doing taekwondo, a martial art, and fighting in like full contact competition, which is an extremely it's a stereotypically male thing to do to fight at all, but also made me feel like I was living up to the stereotype, right? I was putting myself in physical danger, and it's remarkable how visceral that is when you actually do it. And so, that experience kind of was a mixture of things. Like partly it was like allowing out a kind of suppressed part of my identity of being able to be aggressive, but also it was living up to some ideal that wasn't really me at all. So I feel quite mixed about that experience. I also think reflecting on privilege, I think I noticed almost like a particular time in my life past when I became a certain age where people at work started adding gravity to my words that had previously not existed. And I was like, now I'm someone who knows what they're talking about, because I don't know. My voice has reached a certain pitch or something.
Yeah, the accomplished middle-aged male template is perhaps more set. Yeah. But listening to you, I mean, or also thinking back to my childhood, like we still had a military service when I was growing up, so there were certain expectations of men to go and fight, and I always felt that was the sort of payback for the privileges that you had in some sense. Like there was a counterbalance,
right.
In a sense that you could say, well, how come the women don't have to do this? They don't have to put, kind of risk their life and go into the military or do these kind of services. I mean, I still had to do civil service because I didn't want to join the army. Women could go straight to university. So like there were these levers, I guess, where you felt like there was a place in which women were privileged, and that's gone to some extent now. And then, or at least the older I got, I realized, how hard it is also for women watching my own wife in a way. Like, when do you have children? How does it impact your career? All of those kind of choices. Yeah. Whereas when I was younger, I thought, it might be nice to be a girl if you don't have to go to the army or do these kinds of things. Or like, it seems women's spaces seem to be tighter knit and less competitive, a bit calmer. I like coloring with the girls in break in first grade rather than going out in the playground and running around with the guys.
Yeah, which just kind of emphasises that whole thing about it's about fitting a mould, isn't it? Because I would have hated to be colouring in break. I would much rather be running around outside.
But I mean, growing up, that was still very much the mould in some sense. Like everybody fitted in, and you had the sense of, there was. Like, we're so much more acutely aware of how we don't stereotype our kids. Oh, well, and then we fall into other traps in the way that the toys stores are organized or whatever. But yeah.
So what we got onto after thinking about discussing our experience, what we got onto when we were talking before was the unfairness of different people's experience of what we're talking about, and the fact that some people, at least on the surface, seem comfortable with the script that's been handed to them by society, and some people are extremely uncomfortable with it, and just how unfair that whole setup is.
Yeah, I mean, I wonder if there's anyone who truly feels that they fit the mold. Is there not a sense that we're all looking from the outside and, oh, well, there was such and such at so and so at school, and that group of people really kind of, they just. But yeah, I mean, not to diss what you're saying. That there's definitely some people who, some of us fit the mold more closely than others, don't we? But it is that weird thing that we almost all feel like we're outsiders and imposters and all the rest of it. It's kind of
that film runs all the time.
Kind of a strange thing.
You're measuring yourself up against something else.
Up against all sorts. But not to take away from the fact that there are some people for whom they're so far from the script that it makes life hellish and miserable. And that's a really different experience.
Yeah, in contrast to some people who, even though they might feel a bit uncomfortable, probably don't really have to think about this very much.
And now you do what they tell you. And now you do what they told you.
And for everyone who gets fitted into one of these scripts, there's a taking away of choice there, right? There's like you only get to follow the path that is acceptable for you to follow.
Yeah.
It leads you to wonder, like, what it would. It feels so alien, I think, to think of the idea of what it would be like if people like followed their interests without being told what to do in that kind of binary.
Yeah, how we'd even not read each other in that way, right? Not primarily as male and female, like we're taught, as I said earlier, from the very first steps what we are. Like it's part of how we taught our names, how we are dressed even as babies.
Yeah,
it's with us, and so we're completely surrounded by this imbalance and unfairness.
Yeah, it's very hard to construct sentences that talk about people that don't immediately tell you how you should be receiving them in terms of their gender. All right, well, we promised we'd talk about the Bible.
Right. Oh, that's going to help now.
So we've got a little list that we made of bits of the Bible and how unhelpful they are. Are there any that are helpful here? No, I think they're all unhelpful. Or maybe one. So
what, you're promising us a rabbit?
Oh, no rabbits. No
rabbits, okay.
So first thing on our list is making a woman out of a man's rib.
Yeah, I mean that's where you realise the Bible's definitely written by men, wasn't it? It's like we can't quite cope with the idea that actually we were all born in a slightly unpleasant way that was very much dependent on women. So we're going to have to invent an origin story that actually sets the tables round and sets that right and makes sure that it's very clear that in the beginning women came from men.
All came from a man's rib while he was asleep.
Yeah. Don't give us. Yeah, that's it. No painful birth there, was it? Just fall asleep. And
no, I mean the painful birth is mentioned in the fall, right?
Yeah. Oh, yeah. That's a different thing, isn't it? But yeah. So there's. Yeah. It's very. It feels very much like right. Let's just sort out this one fundamental problem.
Yeah, I can't believe that's really, really what happens, right? What really must have happened at the beginning must have been.
Oh, bizarre. Yeah. So. Yeah, that's problematic to start off with, isn't it? Really, but I mean, you did point out, Jörg, that when Paul quotes this in the New Testament, that he does give the flip side of it as well. I forget what it says. 1 Corinthians 11,
it kind of flips it around and says, hang on, let me find it. Oh, for as woman, so 1 Corinthians 11:12, for as woman came from man, that's citation of this verse, of the creation myth, so also man is born of woman. So there's that sort of circular thing. But again, you could argue exactly that's just deepening it, But the original woman came from man, so therefore, now she has to pay
So
for
we're about even.
birthing men.
Yeah.
So it's just equaled out in some ways. I guess.
But maybe he's using that to say, we're all no one is above someone else, right, or something like that.
Yeah. But
it's just, apart from that, it just feels like this whole creation story is very much kind of setting out a very everything's very straightforward, isn't it? There's a man and there's a woman, and obviously you've got the bits about the temptation and the way that they interact together, and then the fall. I don't know, it's just, you've got the theme of the temptress and women being the source of problems, and
the story's just about a man. Like, there's a man. Once upon a time there was a man.
There was a man,
and he needed a companion.
Yeah, so we thought we'd better make one.
Yeah.
Well, actually, we made some first that weren't really quite up to the.
So it's very complimentary about women.
A dog wouldn't do it.
They're definitely a good companion.
All right. Okay. Thanks. That's what I aspire to, Andy. To be a good companion to the men in my life. It's the highest honour.
But that's it. That's
That's
exactly how this verse is preached, right? I mean, this is exactly the point.
But that's how it reads, right?
That's how it reads, because it is a man's world. Like, Adam is the one naming everything. Like, how masculine is that? Like, he sets out the intellectual world. God says, "Here, I've made all this thing. You now go and discover and name it." It's all built around his intellect. And then that's not quite what he needs. I mean, that is the only movement I find interesting in that man is not complete. Men are not complete in just subduing the world and naming it and so on. There is something that still doesn't close that desire off. And I think it's interesting that the Bible points to that, rather than saying, like the other creation account, well, just like all the animals, he's going to need a counterpart so they can procreate. At least it puts a psychological component into this and says, you're not going to be happy alone. You don't live for yourself. Now, we probably need to then unpack this sort of gender complementarity idea, that it's always about a man and a woman and so on. But at least there's the recognition of the incompleteness of men, that they don't live by themselves, that women are not simply their fields in which to sow the seed, which is also other biblical imagery, and they're just passive there to entertain them, but that there's a desire, that there's an incompleteness that they cannot fill themselves.
And we can take that to be about humans as well, and talk about just the incompleteness of us as individuals, and need for companionship and community.
I guess the other alternative you have biblically is the first creation account, which is actually the younger one, is just binaries left and right. Light, darkness, land, water, all the different animals, pair by pair, and then he created them in the image of him. God created humans in the image of him. Male and female, he created them. God blessed them and said, "Be fruitful, increase in number, fill the earth, subdue it, rule over the fish in the sea." So they rule together, but it's all built around...
And they subdue together.
And they subdue together, but it's all built around just this sort of reproductive, fecund unit. Whereas in the older creation account, we have we have desire named.
All right. So then the male account continues. Male-centered account continues with lots of characters who are polygamous.
Yeah,
lots of male characters.
Yeah, exactly. We talked about the fact that we can't quite work out when this died out as a practice in the Old Testament, but it very much is not there, as in women having lots of husbands. So it's traditional in that sense, and it's hard to tell whether the Bible is actually disapproving of that or not. There's no scripture that we can think of where it says you shan't be polygamous. This went wrong because you had many wives. But on the other hand, a lot of these stories where there are many wives seem to talk about it all being difficult and difficult relationships and things not going well. So
Yeah.
And the heroes of these accounts also do lots of other things that are definitely wrong. So it's, you know, it's not, but it's just not even an issue, is it? In those stories, it's just like he just had a lot of wives. It's not there's no moral judgment made.
Taken as that was just what you did. If you were a powerful patriarch, you had lots of wives
and sheep.
And lots of sheep. Let's not link those two things. That's not wise.
Children and all of that. But I mean, you could argue that the sort of a second creation account, the sort of older one, all of this stuff about therefore man will leave his mother and father and be united to his wife, and they will become one flesh. That there is this idea of an intimate unit. So again, pre-fall, right? That then is spoiled, so that all these other stories, they go wrong because it's desire misdirected. It's you know, I mean, there's not one positive polygamous story. I mean, there are successful patriarchs, but all of the, you know, even if you think of Jacob's wives, they have this really weird,
especially
you know,
not good, is it?
But he's a successful patriarch, right? I mean, he blesses everybody, he dies, he doesn't do anything wrong, but that part of his life isn't great.
No.
Abraham messes it up even more, I mean, earlier, and so it's like there's not one positive story, and then of course we get into xenophobia as well, which is probably, I mean, I'm not an Old Testament scholar, but this is probably what killed off the multiple wives. The more sort of Israel becomes self-enclosed, they kind of forbid the importation of women, and then at some point, you know, how do you have a just society if some men have all the women? I guess it's that xenophobia that kills off polygamy, because you don't acquire wives anymore through warfare or whatever.
Right, yeah.
And I just find it weird that that's never really mentioned when we kind of talk in church about about it being all about one man and one woman. It's never. It's kind of just feels like so often we read the Old Testament. We've all heard these stories so many times that we gloss over a lot of the awful aspects of them, and most often those awful aspects are chauvinism, misogyny, and the patriarchy, amongst lots of other things. But I just worry sometimes that by just constantly telling these stories and not calling them out, we just sort of normalize it. It just becomes, well, this is how men behave. Is it good to be bringing up children on all these stories when there's all this stuff in them that doesn't get mentioned? You don't say, oh, and Abraham banished, it was Hagar, wasn't it, out into the wilderness, and you don't say, wasn't Abraham awful, what a dreadful way to treat anybody. You say, oh, wasn't it amazing that God looked after her?
Yeah.
And it's like, that's
and it, like the awful situation at the very centre of each story is not even mentioned. We take some deep meaning from like how many wives there were, but we never talk about how awful it probably was to be the 12th least favourite wife.
Yeah, I mean, I suppose I have this strange kind of empathy with one of Jacob's wives sharing a name, and I always thought it was an awful story. Yeah. I mean, can you imagine being that poor woman who just like gets given, with presumably no say on her part, gets given to this man, to Jacob, and probably knows all the time that he's in love with her sister. I mean, just horrible. Just not, and I've always found that story made me feel horrible. And that was obviously, with the name link, a very personal thing. But I just feel like on a lesser degree, it kind of does that to women, hearing these stories all the time and never hearing the behaviour called out. And it always just being glossed over because it's part of the story.
I mean, the historian in me wants to take this even bit further, or maybe in a slightly different direction, and also say like we've romanticized these relationships when they were economic. We kind of read this sort of idea of marital union into something that just didn't work that way. And then later on, we took that same story to other places that did have polygamy and said, no, you can't do this because it's unbiblical. And people would quite rightly say, wait, what do you mean? There are plenty of examples in the Old Testament. They say, no, but in the New, and because it's all about one man, one wife, and becoming one flesh, so therefore we don't no longer do this. But actually, that's only one way of thinking about heterosexual relationships, the sort of romantic fulfillment ideal. Whereas in some societies, basically the bonding works differently. It works to some extent between the women running the household. The men don't really matter as much in the homestead. They get pushed around to different places. So there's different ways of having polygamy culturally and traditionally that we also then shouldn't simply just read from one norm of how to have intersexual relationships. Or is that taking it too far? I mean, like, I don't know.
Well, are you defending polygamy?
I'm not defending polygamy, but I mean, I don't want to live in that way, and I can't imagine that it's good, but I'm also wary of the colonial imposition saying that relationship must be about that one flesh, one soul, one-on-one, when there are stable ways of having relationships in countries that, yes, they are patriarchal, but that doesn't mean that women don't carve out their spaces, and it doesn't necessarily make them that much less unequal than what we've just unpacked about our own growing up, even though we're
if we try and impose what it would be like if we were in that situation with our cultural background, that will misunderstand it, certainly.
Because I think it takes it out of the context of a community, because we conceive of the nuclear family as being like kind of the highest ideal of units, then we can only imagine polygamy in the context of a nuclear family. And actually, I suppose you might see that perhaps with the Mormons in the States and stuff, but it's much more, it's different in different cultures because the whole family unit is embedded into the community in a very different way to the way that we do that. So it doesn't.
That's the point. Thanks for that. That's exactly what I was trying to say in a much better way. And this is not to defend it or say this is better or worse or whatever. I just think we need to be careful to understand the full social picture, because otherwise we're blind to what the way we've arranged marriages does to us.
Yeah, I mean, I think the way the stories read, they still read like it's a story about a man and the women are a property. So
yeah, and the point
even just that is sort of horrific, even if I don't understand anything else about the context.
Yeah, but we don't read them. We don't unpack the entire social context. We don't say this was about feeding people. This was about we read this sort of romantic relationship into Hagar, into Abraham and Sarah, when really it's all about, well, if I have no son, then I'm going to be gone. Like, this doesn't matter. I'm not a successful patriarch. So like the wider communal expectation on this family was something completely different than what we are reading into these stories now.
Okay, so more things from the Bible. So other than being a useful piece of property, the other character for a woman in the Bible is as a temptress, like Delilah, or even like Eve, or like Potiphar's wife. Stories about a man. A woman is just a character achieving a particular purpose in the story.
Well, we were remarking that nobody gives Potiphar's wife a name in the Bible. She's just the property of the man, and the problem was that she didn't see fit to just behave as she should as the property of that man. She decided to take matters into her own hands in ways that I wouldn't condone, but could argue she was exploring one of the few avenues she had to take some kind of control over her own life.
And Potiphar presumably did similar things, but...
Oh, goodness me. Surely not.
Surely not. Not a high-ranking politician like that. Yeah.
No, indeed.
Who are the good women? So we have...
Yeah, that's good women. Thanks.
We have a Deborah. There's the occasional successful warrior. Right? Was it Deborah? What was her name? Then we have the submissive Ruth. Faithful, going along with mother-in-law.
Courageous. So she.
Yeah.
But yeah,
her salvation. Esther. But both of those women, like
Esther's courageous.
Deborah breaks out as a warrior. She breaks the mold. But for Ruth and Esther, salvation is submission, right? Ruth has to crawl up at Boaz's feet, which...
For Ruth, maybe. But for Esther, she breaks out of her role a lot. Puts herself at enormous physical risk by acting out of her
allotted submissive role.
Well, but doing that because she's beautiful and she's banking on him having mercy on her if she was...
Yeah, it's still within that very submissive framework.
Yeah.
She's using the tools at her disposal, isn't she, essentially?
Yeah.
But, yeah, it's difficult to think what else she could have done.
Yeah.
Then we have Mary.
Yeah.
What do we do with her? Not to get
What's Mary's character?
Well... And the woman
She's
shall
happy.
be delivered through childbirth comes to mind.
She's happy to be chosen by God.
Yeah.
She's important.
She sings a fantastic song at the beginning of Luke about the rich shall be cast down and the lowly shall be lifted up. It's one of my favourite bits of the Bible.
Yeah. Right. So she is the most empowered. Why? Because she gave birth to God, as one of her old predicates goes, Theotokos.
Still defined in terms of a man.
And holding a child. In almost all the icons.
Right. Yeah.
There is a really, if you've ever gone up to Ely in the cathedral, in the Ladies' Chapel, there is a picture there's a statue of Mary, which is actually very feminine. She's a fully present, slightly roundish figure, raising her arms and standing really strong by herself. It's a very modern figure, and it was controversial. She's blue, but she's not the sort of virgin stereotype. It's like total female power. It's really interesting. Maybe I can even pull up a picture for the listener.
But I mean, women have always... Because women's power has always been circumscribed in certain ways, they've always had to be creative about how they exert power, because so much of the time they've lived in societies where physical force was always a threat. I mean, we haven't really talked about that as yet, that women so much of the time have at the back of their minds a fear of physical harm. More so, hundreds of years ago than we do now. But still, I mean, it happens all too frequently. Women get killed by the people that they live with, by people out on the street. Domestic violence is still rife. And so women's role always seems to have been finding those spaces where you can be powerful, and that might be giving birth to the Son of God, or it might be making yourself beautiful so that the king will listen to your request. But that doesn't mean women should forever act in those spaces, but that's often what's been possible.
Yeah.
It's also worth pointing out, talking about violence, that like violence that is purely based on gender issues is also still very much alive in our society when we look at violence against transgender people.
True.
So it's not even, even though we might think that in the West things are better, it's, we haven't moved away from violence that is actually purely gender based. I guess you could say that about what you were saying anyway, Leah.
Yeah.
So
The risk of violence is massively. The risk of experiencing violence or being murdered is massively altered by your gender.
By your gender and your sexuality, of course, as well. So, violence against people from different communities is very much higher, isn't it, than just of heterosexual.
So where then does this leave us with Mary? That in essence we're saying, well then, acting out your gender power, that's what the answer is. So, clearly she's the heroine of the Bible, of the Christian Bible, and and of the Christian faith. And that in itself is very interesting too, that, in large parts of the Christian faith, there was a need to have a strong female figure, and reminding everybody that men are born from women. So, there's something that was really lost in Protestantism in when Mary becomes pale. But is that then redemption? Not, because we were talking about earlier, another possible verse is there's neither male nor female and so on. But is that just idealism, and then the real thing is to act out your gender? I'm being provocative here, but if Mary is the example, then that's the answer.
Is Mary the example?
I think what I'm saying is that she was the example that was possible at that time and in that place,
right.
And that doesn't mean that should always be the way that women's power is able to be exercised, but it was the way that her power was exercised at that time.
Right.
I also feel like we need to separate the character of Mary in her context from the symbol of Mary in religion, right? As a kind of fertility goddess, or as just a symbol of womanhood, holding the baby, and that being the kind of role of a woman. That doesn't say anything really about the person Mary. It's more about this symbol that's been created out of that.
Yeah. And even, it's just reading the sort of story of Still Mary on the announcement of the birth, or that she was going to become pregnant, right? And the interesting bit is that she claims consent, even though that's not necessarily given to her by the way the angel speaks to her.
Okay.
So it says, "Greetings, you're highly favored, the Lord is with you." Mary was greatly troubled and wondered what kind of greeting this might be. And the angel said, "Do not be afraid. You have found favor with God. You will be with child and give birth to a son, and you are to give him the name Jesus. He will be great, and you will be called the Son of Most High. The Lord God will give him the throne of his father David, and he will reign over the house of Jacob forever, and his kingdom will never end." And then she says, "How will this be, since I am a virgin?" The angel answered, again, "The Holy Spirit will come upon you, and the Most High will overshadow you. The Holy One to be born will be called the Son of God." And then a bit about her, Elizabeth, her relative, and then Mary answered, "I am the Lord's servant. May it be to me as you have said." So she's never been asked consent. Her being a virgin is not a problem. There's no concern about how it might look. And yet she then finds the strength to say, "Okay, I think I agree with your plan." It's,
as I say, women learn to take power where they can take power.
Yeah, in a very small,
even when it's not
place.
Even when it's not proffered, even when it's hard, in a very small manner. It's kind of what you learn to.
So that's as much as a rabbit as we're going to get, is it?
Yeah, I think so. don't think so.
Wow.
All right, so we did have.
I mean,
some,
on a similar
go on.
vein, I like a really tiny story that I don't know. I might have heard a sermon on this years and years ago. It's always stuck in my head. It's in Joshua. It's a nice little twist around about women taking a little bit of something that wasn't really offered. Caleb, this is them divvying out the land after they've gone into the promised land. Caleb said, I will give my daughter Achsah in marriage to the man who attacks and captures Kiriath Sefer. Okay, so we're back to women being given away as prizes for stuff. Othniel, son of Kenaz, Caleb's brother, took it. So Caleb gave his daughter Achsah to him in marriage. However, I don't think Achsah was too chuffed about this, because one day when she came to Othniel, so this man that she'd been given to as a piece of property, she urged him to ask her father for a field. I don't think Othniel was maybe a little bit spineless, because when she got off her donkey, Caleb asked her, what can I do for you? And she replied,
Can I have a field?
She says, do me a special favour. Since you've given me land in the Negev, give me also springs of water. So Caleb gave her the upper and lower springs. So it's tiny. It's a nice little, she tries to persuade her husband to man up and to ask for a field. He's obviously not quick enough off the mark, and her dad knows what she's like. So she says, I'll have a field. I'd like also the springs of water, please.
So I could do something with the fields, perhaps.
Wow. Exactly. Anyway.
Gosh.
And why did that stick with you, Leah?
Sorry?
Why
it
did that
stuck
stick
with me because I like the fact that it was okay to not fit into what you were expected to do.
Right. Yeah.
To go, well, okay, thanks for that. And I think that sometimes, I think it is good to have a relationship with God that's like that says, okay, well, I can see where we're going with this, but I'd like something more. Doesn't mean you're going to get it though, does it? But
yeah. And I mean, that same
attitude.
story goes on all the way to the New Testament, right? Like, there are women who lead churches, who are matriarchs, who own the church. And yet, when it then comes to instructions of how a church should be structured, of course, the later pastoral letters then have all sorts of things to be said. And elders shall be husbands of but one wife, and so on. So we have monogamy, of course, but also only men. But even Paul himself in 1 Corinthians 11, even the same Paul who says there's neither male nor female, neither free nor slave, and so on, he then says, propriety in worship. Women should have their head covered, and it's not a good sign of authority. Or as you were saying in the pre-talk, Leah, like, let's not ruffle feathers of culture. Whatever.
Yeah, I mean
go on.
That's how I read so much of that stuff in the Old Testament. And as I say, maybe this is me and my proverbially trying to pull the rabbit out of the hat there. I read it that the early church was so much going against the prevailing culture by saying, no, Jesus is Lord, not Caesar. And as we know, that ended up with Christians being thrown to the lions and persecuted and whatever. And so it's almost like Paul's trying to keep a lid on everything else. He's kind of going, well, that's disruptive enough. So these other things, let's just follow proprietary. And obviously, easy for a privileged white man to say that, right?
Right.
I'm not a white man.
Right.
Sorry.
Well,
easy for a privileged man from an educated background in a position of authority to say
white
that.
in a certain way, yeah.
Yeah, and we hear that over and over again, don't we? There's a bigger battle on here. Let's just put these issues about ethnic diversity or women's rights. Let's just put them to one side, because what the church is really here to do is to do this. It's to evangelize. It's to bring new people into the church. And so
you don't want to present a divided front. Yeah.
No. So let's just tone that stuff down, because it just ruffles feathers that we don't need to ruffle. I don't think that excuses Paul, but it kind of helps me to try and understand it, because it is uncanny the number of times when women or slaves or whoever are told to do certain things. So often it's for the sake of proprietary. It pretty much says it in the text, kind of let's let's not give a bad impression. Let's not cause problems. I don't think I'm wrong. I think it does say that quite a few times in that. But you were reading earlier.
It's about propriety. The cover.
Yeah, it's about
it's her shame. Like her hair is her glory, so it's covered, and men don't have long hair. So there's a very clear cut gender divide and expectation what you do and stay within that mold. And therefore, when we say there's neither male nor female, that's just spiritual, right? That just means before the Lord we're all the same, but please, let's not look the same. Or God forbid, do the same things.
It does trouble me that that passage about women covering their heads, that's the same passage that talks about men not having long hair, right? Mm-hmm. Is it also the passage that says women shouldn't talk in church? Or is that somewhere else? Anyway, but what troubles me is that how seriously we the historical church have taken some of those statements, and how non-seriously we've taken the one about men having long hair. And similarly, how non-seriously we've taken the fact that there are polygamous relationships in the Old Testament. Like if we ever claim that we are taking the clear meaning or the straightforward meaning of the Bible, then this gives the lie to that. Like even if there are people out there who think men shouldn't have long hair because it says so in the Bible, they're not going around preaching about that and how evil these men are who have long hair in the way they are about the issues that are.
It's also in 1 Corinthians later on in 14. Sorry. Yeah, it's around in the context of tongues and behavior in the service. Orderly worship.
So nearby enough that my point makes sense.
Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah, good. Orderly worship. It's almost like kind of these people are coming along to this amazing new it wasn't a religion at that time, but they're following the way, and there's an amazing amount of liberty and freedom in there, and it's almost like kind of the church leaders are going, "Oh, flip! What have we unleashed here?" We've just got to put it slightly back in the box.
Well,
because, what kind of a reputation are we going to have? We don't want to detract from the message that we're trying to get across, which is about Jesus.
Yeah.
And,
I mean, to be fair to Paul, perhaps. I mean, what scholars usually point to is that, it's a bit of context. Corinth, harbour town, all sorts of loose folks hanging about.
Yeah.
And then this
we don't want to be seen as part of that.
Hyper-charismatic church in the middle. Galatia, lots of Jewish community, people worried about circumcision and kind of hitting in there and saying, well, look, stop. It's not about these things. But that only goes so far, you're absolutely right. Like the message then when you go to slavery, the same story again obtains, is like, let's spiritualize everything and not change how we relate to one another. Or I think yes, relate to one another differently because we're now spiritual people, but it doesn't mean that our social status changes. Yeah, sorry.
Yeah. No, I was just going to say that I think that is what it comes down to for me, is these binary positions where we're all so demarcated and separated out. That is a barrier to relationships so often, and to being part of a community. And it's so much about how I identify myself as an individual, and not about my place in a wider community where...
Right.
Yeah.
Now, I mean, so basically, if I were to say, what can I tell a growing up female from the Bible, it's really nothing. And also men, really. But like in terms of like, where are the role models? What is the positive thing the Bible says about women? There's plenty of male heroes. The female heroes, as we've just discovered, are the ones who, by submission, attain a higher place. Mary being the best example, or just kind of take
the other Mary who sat at Jesus' feet and didn't go and do the dishes.
Right.
I like her.
Yeah, that's true. Yeah, Jesus had some female followers that seemed cool.
But Jesus' behaviour is pretty encouraging, right? I know he's a male hero, but
well, woman at the well has a weird mansplaining stuff going on. No.
Well, please don't spoil that story for me. I think I see that as quite positive.
He's nice and everything, but it's like, draw some water for me, as a way of showing her that he does respect her, okay. And then your husband is dead, the moment she draws water, he goes straight into her sexual affairs.
Well, that was presumably at the top of her mind.
Maybe.
That's how I read it.
Yeah.
He spoke to her where she was at, right? The same way he did with lots of people.
And maybe is that a male way of thinking about that would be at the top of a woman's mind? Maybe she wanted to get out of those relationships rather than think about them, but...
Well, maybe. But, the whole story is about how she was there at that time because of her... low status.
Yeah. That she was strong at that time.
At the top of her mind, I'm talking about her whole situation, not like her sexual misdemeanors so much as her status.
Her status, yeah.
All right, so alternative visions. We better move on. We're taking our time with this. We had a lot of biblical things too. So Jesus said there would be no marriage in heaven.
Mm.
Does that lead? Do we look at heaven as like an aspirational thing that we should try and be like how we're going to be in heaven now? And is no marriage? Is that genderless?
No, I don't know. I mean, like, we've had this whole conversation about heaven, right? But
we better not go there again.
No, but what I was going to say is, like, linking this back to the story of desire that the Bible opens with in that sort of earlier creation account, that Adam is not fulfilled, and that somehow in heaven that as we are seeing in the sort of biblical stories, that the way that humans try and fulfill that desire is often not very healthy, not very well, and even some of the misogyny and even some of the sort of gender-based violence even begins with a misdirected desire to be accepted. And again, that's not to defend that, but it's like that same like, but I need to be recognized by you and to become complete, that same like illness at the heart of men, that somehow gets cancelled out in heaven. There's a closing of that desire, or is that the idea, that we will neither marry nor be given in marriage, that we find it all of Jesus?
I see it that way. Yeah, that there's a completeness to us. As long as we can define completeness in not in a static sense. Completeness as more in wholeness. Wholeness is a better word. That we come to a place of being whole, not feeling that there's, because most of our sense of lack of this or that is to do with living in a fallen world and having been brought up by fallen people with other fallen people. It creates issues for us, and so if there's a healing of those things that begins with our relationship with Jesus and is further taken on after death, then I think we do find some kind of wholeness. But I'd hate to think that meant we just don't change anymore. That would be weird.
I think the phrase you use about finding it in Jesus, I found that sort of horrifying.
Yeah.
But the idea of some kind of community where we find true kinship is like a really attractive idea, and to some extent, I don't know whether I really think. I was going to say, to some extent, if we could throw off gender, it might just be easier or better to find that family, maybe. I don't know.
But I think you're finding it in Jesus and finding that horrifying is all because of this thing that we've I mean, sorry, I'm totally putting words in your mouth, so tell me if I'm
So I'm
talking
here,
nonsense.
so I can always contradict.
Yeah, you can contradict me. But it's so much because of this wretched obsession that we seem to have in churches about me and my personal Jesus.
Yeah, exactly.
That, that we imagine heaven, as you say, it's all about me and Jesus, and so when I get to heaven, all I will want to do is sit and gaze at Jesus, because he will fulfill my every lack and my every longing. But that's not the picture of heaven that's painted in the Bible. It's of a community together, yes, around the Lamb, but they're together. They're people from every tribe and multitude and nation, and they've come as one. And so yes, Jesus enables that community to form, but we are all part of the same thing. There's not the separation and the distinction anymore. So sorry, is that anything near what you were feeling?
Yeah, absolutely. It's the individualistic thing. It's the sense that it's incredibly lonely that was horrifying about that phrase. I also think it's just listening to you talk, because I think it's really helpful then for you to go to like the Jerusalem Revelation type picture of this new city where everyone from all around the world lives together and in harmony. But there is this patriarch right in the middle of it, that like the enabling of it in that picture is like we're all subservient to this man.
Well, we were all around the lamb that was slain, right? So the lamb that goes against all kind of
That's better.
all set up of what a patriarchy looks like. A lamb that went and, voluntarily gave of themselves in order that others might live, and perpetually stays in that state of sacrifice and givenness. So I don't think that's very patriarchal.
Okay, yeah. So if we're actually around a symbol of submission, that's a better
mode.
We're submitting around the symbol of submission.
A mode of submission, even. So, like, if we connect this back to Genesis 2, where we have this sort of desire that wants to be fulfilled in the one other, and that is foundational to people. I mean, that's what the story of creation is all about, right? It kind of explains who we are and who we find ourselves to be. So we find ourselves with this lack, with this desire, and especially if you grow up in a heterosexual world, to be fulfilled in another, to be complete through another. Then the story of the Bible that emerges from that is actually that desire is there, but the only way to fulfill it is to give yourself, not to demand,
right.
not to. And perhaps maybe then the rib makes a bit more sense as well.
Wow, that's a rabbit.
Well,
That is impressive.
It's a very ghostly rabbit, actually. I'm not sure. I blow on it and it falls apart. But like in a sense that there is an anthropology at the heart of this. I think that's what I'm trying to say, that I find fascinating, that it points us to the fact that we do feel incomplete, that one of the primary ways in which we do feel incomplete is that many of us, I don't want to say all of us, but many of us look for another partner, look for other humans who understand us more completely than others. Mm-hmm. There is a desire to be intimate. And yet, as we've just discussed, there's no good templates for how that could be, even in the Bible. They're all cultural, they're horribly patriarchal, and yes, we can feel so smug about how our relationships are, but then colonialism is not far off in reading other relationships that way. And the only way to escape with Mary and others is to say yes to somebody else's desire, to be there for one another. I don't know. It's a bit too smooth.
It just strikes me listening to this that it's hard to separate the gender scripts that our society has handed to us from gender itself, but there's no doubt in my mind that the gender scripts we've been handed just seem to make it harder to connect, and or maybe not, because maybe there's also like,
well, but none of what I just said needs to be read as gendered.
No, exactly, and that's my point. So all I was hearing was the gender scripts are just getting in the way of achieving this thing. But on the other hand, without any script at all, you can be a bit lost. So maybe we just ended up with whatever script we deserved.
Well, I don't know, but you could still say, like, there is a call to then be realistic about the fact that you're not going to be happy in yourself. That desire that you feel in yourself for another is good. That desire for intimacy is good. And I'm not saying it only goes in one particular sexual expression, not at all. But there is a desire for another that many of us find ourselves with, and that is good. But trying to fulfill that in such a way that only one thing fits, that only that one script, as it were, is allowable, doesn't cut it, because it's not about what fulfills you. It's about learning to enter community so that that intimacy can be filled in ways because you're letting go, because you're opening yourself up. Not because you're looking for somebody to plug that hole or that desire inside you.
Desperately trying to remember the name of the philosopher I heard who talked about the emptiness in us not being something that glibly gets filled when you become a Christian and Jesus comes and fills the emptiness, but that it's just a part of being human, and it that desire for community and stuff is completely natural. So,
well, all of psychoanalysis is built on the idea that we can never experience ourselves in completeness. Jacques Lacan begins with this, that we have this sort of split running through us, that we can never experience ourselves as complete as we see ourselves in the mirror. That's where he begins this desire, and everything comes from that. From that angle, I find biblical anthropology interesting, to say, well, there's something in Adam that he just felt that this isn't it, that drove him forward. But yeah, if we let the gender script get in the way, and then we get women out of ribs to fulfill the man as helpmeets or whatever, it gets horrible.
All right, so I think I'm going to draw us towards the end there. Listen, I know we've barely touched on gender or the Bible or whatever, but we have been waffling for a long time. So, Leah, I was going to ask you to read from the book that we discussed earlier.
So, Elizabeth Edman in this book uses the term queer to mean the ability to step outside of binary either perspectives or identity is probably the easiest way to explain it. So they say in this book, it's one thing to say that Christianity is and must be queer, which is the argument that's being made in the book. And then specifically, to read Paul is to understand that authentic Christian church is and must be queer. The church itself must be a place where binaries are examined and challenged. So this is referring back to the Paul passage that we talked about. There's no longer Jew nor Greek, slave nor free, male or female. This is especially important when the binaries involve power dynamics, which obviously is a big thing in gender, or inform our ability to claim kinship with one another. And that was the really important thing for me, that are we locked in either or perspectives and identities that stop us being at one and in kinship with each other.
Yeah, back to that yearning for companionship and kinship. That's a neat ending. Thank you very much, listener. As I said at the beginning, a long time ago, and as I said in the previous podcast where we talked about this type of stuff, these podcasts are a message of love to you and to each other, and they're not intended to hurt your feelings or generalize about you or anyone else. And we hope you'll take them in that spirit, and we hope that you'll talk to us and educate us where we need educating. And thank you very much, and see you next time.
You've been listening to Justice Warriors. You can subscribe wherever you get your podcasts, and you can also follow us on social media by searching for Justice Warriors, where warrior is spelt like someone who worries about things. If you enjoyed this episode, please subscribe and leave us a rating, since that helps other people find us. Also, please tell your friends about us in real life. We'd love to hear from you. To get in touch, use the email address in the show notes or contact us via the social media links. Thanks for listening.
Now you do what they told you. Now you do what they told you.